I can feel the jitters in my skin, Doctor. But I feel that in time, I will get used to it, he said sheepishly while laying on the red leather couch.
So that is why you made this rather impromptu appointments with me to help you with this new issue you have developed,
the therapist said as he scribbled down some notes on his clipboard. The sound of the pencil scraping across his paper, breaking up the monotonous silence in his office, with the exception of the ticking clock. Indeed it is, Dr. Truden. Indeed it is. I've been dealing with this vexation for a couple of days now, Eric said uncomfortably as he rubbed the back of his neck.
Something must have disturbed you greatly for you to come and see me after all these months.
You didn't seem to be taking the therapy well at all. At the time, I didn't think that I needed it, Dr. Truden, but due to recent revelations, I realized that I need help with something. Something very dire.
Well, as you know, it is my job to give counsel whenever my patients are having issues with something. However, I must advise you that if this dire thing is a threat to yourself or someone else, then you need to go to the police immediately. Is this something that the Crawfordville Police Department would be better equipped to deal with?
Oh, no. Not the police. I can't go to the police with this. They would never believe me. In fact, they might lock me up. They would accuse me of being on drugs, or worse yet, some sort of schizophrenic, Eric said as his eyes darted about the room nervously as if he was searching for hidden eyes. Dr. Truden took note of this on his clipboard.
Intriguing, Eric. Could you explain further?
He said, and gave a quizzical look in Eric's direction over the rim of his glasses. Why, that's why I'm here, Doctor. It's a test, you see.
A test?
Of course, Dr. Truden. A test to see if you will believe me.
Interesting. So, you propose to lie to me right from the beginning and expect me to believe you?
Truden said, half indignantly, as he continued to scribble more on his clipboard. Oh, no. It's nothing like that at all. It's just, if I can convince you of this strange and fantastic story, then perhaps I could also convince others in authority so something can be done about it, Eric said, as his head jerked to the side, betraying a nervous tic.
Strange and fantastic story, you say? Go on.
Of course. Eric's eyes, once more nervously, darted about the ceiling, looking in every corner. He focused on something for a moment before he was snapped out of it by Dr. Truden's inquisition.
Eric, what do you keep looking for?
Oh, I'm sorry, Doctor. It's just they like crawling across the ceiling, and they're quite sneaky while doing it.
What are you on about?
Forgive me. I've gotten ahead of myself. But first I have to ask you, are you aware of the homeless problem around Crawfordville, especially in the area of town we call the Undercity?
Why, yes. Yes, I am aware of it. You're talking about the scads of tunnels and abandoned subway systems that are underneath this city. If I understand correctly, all manner of reprobates and gutter snipes call the area their home.
Why, yes, Dr. Truden, but it's more than just that. Are you aware that several of them have gone missing in the last few months?
I was unaware of such a thing. Of course, I don't want to be accused of being apathetic, but I care little for the underbelly of this city and for those that cannot help themselves.
I can't judge you for your opinion on those that you know little about, Doctor. However, as you know, I am part of a pantry that gives food to the needy and the destitute.
Yes, I do remember that. You mentioned it a few times It's been quite a few months since you've been in to see me, but I do remember that about you.
Good. You do remember. Well, I used to run a food cart that we had stationed outside of one of the major tunnel entrances to the Undercity. We used to have all manner of homeless people, vagabonds, destitute, come up to our food cart in order to get the finest food that we could find, mostly just sandwiches and soup, but they were thankful to have it. Sometimes the line of people would extend all the way back to the tunnel entrance, and we would usually run out of food before the line was completely depleted, and we'd have to, sadly, turn away the latecomers who had the unfortunate timing of being in the back of the line.
It sounds like you were doing a good service indeed for the destitute of Crawfordville.
We were indeed, but then something peculiar began to happen,
Eric said, as his head once more jerked to the side. Eric paused, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to recollect himself. This was not lost on Dr. Truden. Eric, are you aware that you have developed some sort of nervous tic since the last time we have spoke?
Yes, I'm aware. Like I said, I've had the jitters in my skin ever since the incident.
I see. Very well. Continue. You said something peculiar happened.
Yes, indeed. The lines, they started to die down over the course of a few weeks. This wasn't just a few. I mean, there was always an ebb and flow to the line. A few vagabonds would stop showing up, but in the cosmic balance of things, a few new faces would usually arrive to take their place a week later.
Ah, so I see. But isn't this a good thing? Did that not mean that these homeless individuals and the destitute were finding gainful sources of employment, or perhaps relatives to stay with?
It was possible, but highly unlikely. You see, Doctor, I've been helping the destitute around this city for many years, and though there have been times where the lines were not too large, most of the time I was able to help 50 to 60 in a good night. However, with recent changes, it seems like I was barely helping even 10 people, and it wasn't even just me that noticed this. Jacobs, one of my regulars, told me that he had noticed a steep decline, as well as the disappearance of one of his good friends, a gentleman by the name of Styx, that was often seen huddled about a burning barrel that was stationed outside of one of the main tunnel entrances to the Undercity. Styx was a rather elderly man in his late 60s, and was not one to wander too far away from the others, and especially not one to turn down any opportunity to acquire a free meal.
Perhaps it was one of the local gangs that made sport out of him. I understand that the East Side Cyclopses usually make game out of tormenting and killing the homeless around this city. Ghastly people, indeed, but they would not be above killing an elderly homeless man, since they knew no one would miss him.
If only that were the case. However, I fear the reality was much more horrific than simple murder.
At saying this, Eric nervously looked about the ceiling. Are you okay? You seem to be nervous about something.
I'm sorry, Doctor. It's just, they take you from the ceiling. That's their preferred mode of ambush.
What the deuce are you talking about, Eric?
I'll get to that in a minute, Doctor. I have to be careful about how much I reveal to you, otherwise you'll think me a loon. Please, listen to my story and understand.
Dr. Truden squinted inquisitively at Eric. He then scribbled down potential loon on his clipboard as Eric continued his story.
You see, it was a few days after Styx had turned up missing when I saw him exiting the tunnels from the Undercity. However, the way that he moved was unnatural. His body had a strange jerking motion about it. He limped one moment, and then seemed to walk fine another. He staggered forward a few times, as though he might fall, but then flailed his arms about like a marionette. It was almost as though he was trying to gain control over his own appendages, much like watching a toddler learning to walk for the first time.
So he was on some sort of drug.
That was my thought at first, but I've seen all manner of drug addicts and people spun out on things. Obviously you would in my line of charity, but this was different somehow. His eyes, it wasn't like they were glazed over in inebriation. It was like there was something missing from it, you know? Like he had lost some sort of spark of humanity. Even more peculiar, the other destitute around him seemed to avoid him like the plague. It wasn't just like avoiding somebody that was on drugs. They seemed to be legitimately afraid of him, as though he could lash out and strike them at any moment. As he shambled towards my food cart, I felt an uneasiness about my stomach, like I should run, that instinct that I imagine a gazelle gets just before it's pounced on by a lion. He just kept staring at me the entire time, and that's when I realized that he had not blinked. Not once. Not since exiting the tunnels, at least. Of course, Jacobs had seen him, and seemed ecstatic to have found his friend again. After thinking him dead, he rushed up to try and greet Styx. However, as he stepped in his way, Styx simply brushed up against him and kind of shoved him to the side. It wasn't overly aggressive. It was more like he was hyper-focused on myself. Of course, Jacobs was looking in confusion. He shouted out Styx's name, but Styx just kept on trudging forward in that unnatural, eldritch, jerking motion that made me ever more uncomfortable as he was nearly to my food cart. I suddenly felt compelled to pull down the metal door of the window to yell out that we were closed for the night, but I held my resolve as he shambled closer, ever closer. Then, like a horse bucking, he toppled forward, flopping his arms and head right onto the counter. He laid there, just flopped over the counter for quite some time, unmoving. It was as if the very exertion of going from the tunnel to my cart had completely exhausted him, and for a second I thought that maybe he had fallen unconscious. Just as I leaned over to try and shake his shoulder, he snapped up his head in my direction. I let out a shriek and flung myself to the far wall of the food cart as he stared at me with those unblinking eyes, unmoved by my outburst.
Fascinating. So, if you do not believe it was drugs, what do you think it was? Perhaps a stroke or some other neurological disorder, Dr. Truden said. He was now leaning forward in his red leather chair, listening intently. He wasn't used to being so drawn in by one of his patient's stories. Eric continued.
I thought that at first too. However, I now know that it takes them some time to get used to controlling the body once they take a host.
I beg your pardon, Eric. What are you rambling?
Of course, Doctor. I apologize. Like I said, if I were to tell you everything right from the beginning, you would think me a loon. Please, let me continue.
I want you to understand something right now. Though you are paying me for an hour of my time, I do not like being toyed with. You already told me that this was going to be some sort of test to see if I believed you, which, at this point, I'm not certain which part of your story is true or fabrication, but if you're trying to convince me of something otherworldly, I'll have you know I have no time for it, and I will ask you to leave.
I'm sorry, Doctor. Like I said, I've been through a lot recently,
and I'm willing to help you with real issues. But if you're trying to set up some sort of little green men scenario, I'll have you know that I've got several patients that are going to be coming in today that have legitimate problems, and I do not tolerate game playing.
I assure you, there's no games, sir. May I continue?
Very well, you may. So, what did he do after throwing himself on your counter?
Well, for a while he just sort of stared at me with that unblinking look in his eyes. But then he said 2 words in a matter-of-fact tone: need nutrients. So, being the man that I am, I dispensed him a bowl of soup. Despite being offered a spoon, he promptly took the bowl, lifted it up to his face, and started sucking on it. Not drinking from it, like you would imagine someone to use a bowl. He put his face right down in the center of the damn thing and just started sucking. I can vividly remember that unnatural gurgling sound he made as he practically inhaled the soup. I could see chunks of chicken and noodles going up into his nose. However, despite the unorthodox way of drinking it, he got the majority of it down before putting the bowl back on the counter with a rather alarming thud. He didn't thank me. Instead, he twisted his torso in an unnatural, contortionistic way, and then his legs followed as he turned around and started shambling back to the tunnel entrance. I watched in perplexed silence. Jacob once more shouted out Styx's name. Styx paused only briefly, tilting his head towards Jacob's. Then he said, "Follow," before turning back to the tunnel and shambling in. Jacobs looked at me in confusion, then shook his head and turned to follow his friend. My blood ran cold at seeing the exchange, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I thought about telling him to stop, that something wasn't right, but I could not find the words to do so, and I watched as Jacobs disappeared into the tunnel, following his abnormal acting friend. I can only imagine that Jacobs was trying to help him. Of course, I thought about reporting the whole incident to the police, but I imagine that they would have told me that he was simply on drugs and that it wasn't something that they were going to look into, as many of the homeless around Crawfordville were prone to indulge in such toxins. I closed up my cart early that night. Not that it mattered. Like I said, there were hardly any patrons that were even showing up at the cart at this point. It seemed that many of them had become spooked and either had retreated into the tunnels deeper or were missing due to some other pernicious reason. I didn't bring the food cart back by the tunnels for a few days after that incident. I felt an uneasy feeling in my stomach, and I simply wanted to avoid the area until I overcame this queasiness. Of course, I scoured the newspaper, trying to see if anybody had been covering the missing homeless around the city. Of course, the newspapers were too busy focusing on the serial killer of the month to give the vagabonds of the city much heed. I realized that if anything were to be done about it, I would have to shed some light on it myself. Thus, after I had mustered up the courage over my few days' absence, I returned to the entrance of the tunnels. But I did not bring my food cart with me. Instead, I had with me my flashlight and my video recorder. I showed up midday with the hopes that whatever I may find in the tunnels would somehow be lessened by the fact that there was still daylight on the surface. Though once I found myself in those dark and dank tunnels, I realized that it was irrelevant what time of day that I would have come, for the darkness of the Undercity was vast, and the sparsely lit torches and lights that the vagabonds had erected was not enough to completely mitigate the stretching darkness that enveloped the Undercity.
You went into the tunnels by yourself. Did you tell anybody?
As I'm certain you're aware, I have no wife, no children, and my mother is very elderly, and I did not want to worry her with my dark adventures underneath the city,
Eric said, as his head jerked violently to the side. He shut his eyes once more, then regained his composure.
I searched about the tunnels. I found remnants of other people that had been down there, some belongings hastily strewn about on a blanket, an old lighter, a glass pipe. At one point I found what appeared to be a makeshift shiv that somebody had fashioned to defend themselves with. As I continued, stumbling through the tunnels, I did come across an odd room. It was small, probably about 4 feet by 6 feet, and completely filled with doll heads. No bodies, no clothes, just doll heads. That particular room spooked me quite a bit, though I did not feel it had anything to do with the disappearance of the homeless people. With the exception of the doll head room, everything else was all common sights to be found within the Undercity. However, one thing that I didn't notice was any presence of a living person. That is, until I encountered him in the darkness.
Him? Was this somebody that you knew?
I had been wondering for about an hour and a half when my light shined across his face. It was Jacob's. He looked at me with a slightly glazed-over look in his eyes. I thought that glazed look had been caused by the light and the fact that he had been wandering about the darkness of the Undercity for so long, but I now realize it was because he was one of them,
Eric said, as his head once more jerked violently to the side. Eric, remember what I said. I do not have time for nonsensical stories.
And I assure you, Dr. Truden, that no matter how fantastical my story may seem, every word I say is true.
So, this is what you're trying to convince me.
That there are some sort of body snatchers that are abducting the homeless. Some sort of reptilian humanoids from another planet, if you will, that are trying to infiltrate our society. Humanoids? Reptilian? No. That is such narcissistic nonsense.
Narcissistic, you say?
Yes, Dr. Truden. Of course the human race would believe that anything outside of their realm that had any sort of intelligence would have to look like them, would have to be humanoid, as you say.
Oh, forgive me. I forgot that I was talking to an expert about little green men from another planet, Dr. Truden said in a sardonic manner as he scribbled game-playing and delusional on his clipboard. Eric sat up from the couch and straightened his shirt in indignation.
Little green men from another planet. Didn't you listen to me? They don't look anything like humans. Even green little humans. No. They don't have arms and legs like you do. More like tendrils and appendages. I imagine the closest thing that I could compare them to would be cephalopods, like octopuses, but even that is not quite an accurate description.
Oh, okay. Forgive me. I was wrong, Mr. Expert.
So, what exactly do they look like? Well, if you must know, they are a central mass, devoid of eyes. They don't require eyes, because they do not see, not in the same sense that you would expect sight. They can sense the world around them through vibrations, if you will. They can see an object as though it was energy. That's why they have trouble with human host and blinking. They're so unused to the whole concept of visual sight. Thus, it's a steep learning curve for them to teach their host to blink. Their organs are far more advanced than anything that has evolved on this planet. Their tendrils, for example, they are not static. They can morph and change based on the form that they inhabit.
Ah, just like how one of them inhabited sticks. Is that what you're getting at? That's why he was so jerky, because it didn't know how to control his body. Not properly.
No, of course not. Being able to control a host, it takes time and practice, and sometimes they have to jump to multiple hosts before they get it quite right.
Very well. I'm amused how far you're willing to go into detail about your story. How do they take a host?
Well, the process is fairly straightforward. They usually wait attached to a ceiling for a suitable host to come by. Once the host is underneath them, they extend a paralyzing barb from the tip of one of their tendrils into the host back. This accomplishes two things. First, it paralyzes the host. Second, it begins putrefying the insides of the host organism, turning their organs, their bones, their brains into mush, while leaving all external structures, such as the skin, the hair, the eyes, completely intact. This process is incredibly excruciating, but through that pain and suffering, they are able to gain a psychic imprint of their host. This, of course, makes it easier for them to mimic the host once they take over the body. Thus, the more fear and pain they can inflict during the assimilation process, the stronger the psychic connection becomes, and the more efficient the mimicry. However, the pain and the suffering, it means little to the Karak.
The Karak. Oh, is that the name of the aliens from your little science fiction fantasy novel that you're working on? You'll have to send me a copy of the finished work. It's very riveting, at least as far as tabloid trash goes. Dr. Truden laughed, tossing his clipboard onto the table next to him, no longer holding up any sort of facade that he believed in the story of his patient.
So mocking, Doctor. You are not a good example of a therapist.
I just have little patience for people that would try and waste my time, regardless of if I was being paid by them or not. So let me get this straight. These aliens from another planet.
Actually, the Karak are trans-dimensional entities.
Right. These trans-dimensional entities. They came to our dimension in order to take over the homeless population. Wow, what ambitious creatures.
If you have not figured it out yet, they are very clumsy whenever they first take a host. They need to have practice. Practice comes through repetition. Whenever they infiltrate another plane of existence, they always start with the dregs of the culture they are trying to assimilate.
Ah, okay. All right. I understand now. So they have to have training wheels with the lower caste of society. They start with the homeless, then they work their way up until they find themselves taking over people in positions of power. Is that it?
Yes, Doctor. You understand now, Doctor.
Oh, okay. I see. So, in your little delusional fantasy, you're the savior of mankind. You are the only thing standing between them and taking over all of humanity.
Not quite. Would you like me to finish my story?
Oh, by all means. You have about 10 minutes left, anyway. But I must warn you that after this session, I will never allow you in my office again.
Understood, Doctor. So, I saw Jacob. He had some glazed-over look in his eyes. He told me that he had found Styx, and that he was in, well, a rather bad way. So I began to follow Jacob through the darkened tunnels. He seemed to lead me through countless crossroads and segments, to the points that I began questioning if he even knew where he was going himself. Every now and then, there was some sort of betrayal to him, the way his body jerked, or he would stall up as though trying to kick his own flesh into gear. I made note of this, but I was compelled now. I had to get to the bottom of what was happening in the Undercity. That's when I came across Styx. Or, more accurately, what was left of Styx. It was in a larger chamber within the Undercity. I could hear the dripping of water plip-plopping against the bricks of the floor. Jacob waited at the entryway. He motioned over at something lying in the center of the room. He told me that Styx needed my help, that I was always such a delightful help to the homeless, that surely I would be able to do something to assist him. I walked up. As I did, I felt the moisture underneath my feet, as though I could slip, making me ever more cautious. As I walked towards the shape in the center of the room, I felt uneasy again. That crawling sensation on the back of my neck. I slowly lowered my flashlight across the floor, watching its beam dance across the moss-covered bricks. That's when I saw it. It was like a glove or a suit made out of skin. They somehow have a way of preserving the flesh, keeping it flexible whenever they take over a host. But like a hermit crab, once they leave the host, they leave their shell behind. It was clearly the skin of an elderly man. However, it was deflated, its insides completely hollowed. I stared down at it, looking at the vacant void where the eyes once were, the gaped open mouth filled with blackness. That's when I felt it. Something brushing up against the nape of my neck, something moist, something sinister. I felt some tingling in my brain, and as I did, I was compelled to look up. They don't have to have you see them, but it seems to assist in the assimilation process, you understand? For you to see them and no fear right before they drop down from the ceiling and take you. Like a fool, I raised the beam of my light up, and that's when I saw it. Just before. Well, you know what happened after that, I'm certain.
Eric finished his story as he looked over at Dr. Truden. Then once more, his head unnaturally jerked to the side before he regained his composure, then slowly tilted his head back in the doctor's direction. Dr. Truden leaned back in his chair, a sardonic smile across his face. He then chuckled and started to clap. Bravo! Bravo! What a story! What an utter, complete fabrication in order to play some sort of game with me. For what purpose, I don't know, but I must tell you, this has been one of the most unique sessions I've ever had with a patient, even though I don't intend to do a follow-up with you.
Eric stared inquisitively at Dr. Truden before his head jerked off to the side.
So, I imagine that this means that the test was successful. You really believe me, don't you?
Believe you? Didn't you just hear me?
I said that I thought your story was complete and utter nonsense and a waste of my time. Some sort of squid creatures from another dimension coming here, taking over a homeless population in order to train themselves to take more capable hosts. It's utter nonsense. You didn't fool me for a second, Eric, and I'm beginning to question why you thought to waste my time as well as yours.
At this, Eric seemed to get giddy. He lifted up his hands and started rubbing them.
So despite all of this, you still believe that I'm a human, don't you?
Absolutely, Eric. Come on. Did you think that I would even for a second think you were some sort of, what did you call them? Kurok from another dimension? You'll have to try harder than that. And pretending to have that nervous tick to act like you are being controlled by something and that you are still getting used to your body. I mean, I've seen theatrics before for my patients, but it was so obvious from the very beginning that you are simply faking your little tick.
I am so pleased, Doctor. Thank you for this. I now know that I am ready to ascend to a new host, one that has a higher station within society than some charity worker that makes minimum wage at a convenience store.
Dr. Truden scoffed as he rose up from his chair, then turned, making his way towards the door. I know you have about 2 minutes, but at this point, I don't need to hear any more of your delusions or your games or whatever you're trying to accomplish here. I've got about an hour before my next patient arrives, and I would like to spend that time smoking my pipe and listening to some classical music. And now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Truden said, reaching the door of his office. However, as his back is turned to Eric, he starts hearing a peculiar sound behind him. It's a sound unlike any he's ever heard. A strange, stretching, popping sound with a disturbing wetness about it. In confusion, he slowly turned around and looked over at the red leather couch where only moments before Eric had been sitting. Now in its place, there was something unreal draped across the couch. Dr. Truden slowly walked up to it, his mind not quite registering what he was seeing. It was only once he was nearly on top of it that he realized it was something fleshy and flat, like a suit made out of human skin. The eyes, black orbs, the mouth gaped open, and a huge hole in the chest, which was filled with some sort of viscous goo. As he stared over at the suit of skin, still covered in Eric's clothes, he only shook his head in disbelief. No. This isn't real. This is some sort of prank. This isn't real. Even as Dr. Truden shook his head in disbelief, he felt something slimy begin to fondle at the back of his neck. No. This isn't true. It's all delusions. I'm imagining everything. This isn't true. Then Dr. Truden felt a tingling in the base of his skull as he heard something speaking into his mind.
You don't have to look up if you don't want to, Doctor. Regardless, we both know what happens next.
Despite this warning, Dr. Truden stared up into the ceiling as a mass of tendrils, stingers, and appendages suddenly dropped down on him.
No! No! Please!
As he screamed, he felt multiple stingers insert themselves into the base of his back. It felt cold at first, but then increased in acidic heat as he felt his intestines begin to liquefy and his own bones turning into mush. He felt his back being ripped open as some sort of impossible cephalopod-like creature began to force itself into his torso. As it did, it inflated, simultaneously absorbing the putrefied fluids inside of him and expanding to fill in every nook and cranny of its new home. 5 minutes later, Susanna, Dr. Truden's secretary, returned from her hour-long lunch break. She sat at her desk, looking at the myriad of paperwork that she had to file today and the charter of patients that were expected throughout the day. As she looked over her paperwork, she sighed to herself, realizing that she had her work cut out for her this day. She sighed, then resolved herself to start her workload, but was suddenly distracted by the creaking sound of Dr. Truden's door slowly opening up, if just a crack. Susanna spun her swiveling chair around, looking over at the door.
"Oh, Dr. Truden, you startled me, sir."
Dr. Truden stared at her from the crack in his door. His eyes were glazed over and had a blank stare about them. His face was pale and clammy. "I apologize for startling you, Susanna dear. I'm feeling a bit under the weather. Could you cancel all of my appointments for the day?"
"Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that, sir. Did Eric Rocard leave? I didn't catch him passing by whenever I arrived."
"Oh, yes, Susanna. He had to split." It was a rather weird session with him today. He left shortly before you arrived. So do you think you can do that for me? Do you think you can cancel my appointments?
"Oh, yes, sir. Of course, sir. You are the boss, after all."
Dr. Truden smiled through the crack in the door, but as he smiled, his face jerked unnaturally, as though he was still getting used to controlling this new face. "Very good, Susanna. Very good. By the way, you're single, aren't you? I think I remember that." Susanna paused for a moment, straightening up her hair.
Why, yes, sir. Why do you ask?"
"Why? Why, because I have a friend. His name is Jacob, and I've been trying to find somebody for him to have a date with. I think you would do. Just nicely. Just nicely indeed. He doesn't like busy places, but I'm certain you two can find a nice secluded area to get to know each other better. Would you like that, Susanna?"
"Oh, yes. Yes, very much, sir. It's been a while since I've been on a date."
"Very good. Very good indeed. I'm certain he's ready to meet a woman of your standing in society."
Why, thank you, sir. If you're sick, is there anything I can get for you?"
Susanna said, with a concerned look upon her face. Dr. Truden faked a smile, even as his face twitched. "You're too kind, Susanna. But
Don't worry about it. It's just the jitters. I can feel the jitters in my skin. But I feel in time, I'll get used to it. The end.